I am Dr. P. N. Lakshmi Shanmugam, Assistant Professor, Department of Educational Psychology, Tamil Nadu Teachers Education University, Chennai. Let us see about the topic hypothesis. After completing the module, the prospective teachers are able to know the meaning of hypothesis, understand the function of hypothesis, differentiate research hypothesis from alternate hypothesis, develop the skill to test hypothesis, develop the interest on identifying type 1 error and type 2 error. The second important consideration in the formulation of a research problem is the construction of hypothesis. Hypotheses bring clarity, specificity, and focus to your research problem, but are not essential for a study. You can conduct a valid investigation without constructing a single formal hypothesis. On the other hand, within the context of a research study, you can construct as many hypotheses as you consider to be appropriate. Hypotheses primarily arise from a set of hunches that are tested through a study, and one can conduct a perfectly valid study without having these hunches or speculations. However, in epidemiological studies, to narrow the field of investigation, it is important to formulate hypotheses. Hypotheses primarily arise from a set of hunches that are tested through a study, and one can conduct a perfectly valid study without having these hunches or speculations. Example, my health improves during the times when I drink green tea. The importance of hypothesis lies in their ability to bring direction, specificity, and focus to your research study. They tell a researcher what specific information to collect and thereby provide greater focus. You can then conclude whether your hunch was right or wrong. If I eat more vegetables, then I will lose weight faster. If I add fertilizer to my garden, then my plants will grow faster. In this example, you started with a superficial hunch or assumption. In one case, you waited for the event to take place, and in the other two instances, you designed a study to assess the validity of your assumption. And only after careful investigation did you reach a conclusion about the validity of your assumptions. Hypotheses are based upon similar logic. As a researcher, you do not know about a phenomenon, a situation, the prevalence of a condition in a population, or about the outcome of a program. But you do have a hunch to form the basis of certain assumptions or guesses. You test these by collecting information that will enable you to conclude if your hunch was right. The verification process can have one of the three outcomes. Your hunch may prove to be right, partially right, or wrong. Without this process of verification, you cannot conclude anything about the validity of your assumption. Hence, a hypothesis is a hunch, assumption, suspicion, assertion, or an idea about a phenomenon, relationship, or situation, the reality or truth of which you do not know. A researcher calls these assumptions, assertions, statements, or hunches hypotheses, and they become the basis of an inquiry. In most studies, the hypothesis will be based upon either previous studies or on your own or someone else's observation. According to Kerlinger, a hypothesis is a conjectural statement of the relationship between two or more variables. Webster's New International Dictionary of English Language defines a hypothesis as a proposition, condition, or principle which is assumed, perhaps without belief, in order to draw out its logical consequences, and by this method to test its accord with facts which are known or may be determined. Black and Champion defines a hypothesis as a tentative statement about something, the validity of which is usually unknown. In the another definition, Bailey defines a hypothesis as a proposition is stated in a testable form and that predicts a particular relationship between two or more variables. In other words, if we think that a relationship exists, we first state it as a hypothesis in the field. According to Grinnell and Stothers, a hypothesis is written in such a way it can be proven or disproved by valid and reliable data. It is in order to obtain these data as we perform our study. From the above definitions, it is apparent that a hypothesis has certain characteristics. It is a tentative proposition. Its validity is unknown, and in most cases, it specifies a relationship between two or more variables. The function of a hypothesis. While some researchers believe that to conduct a study or requires a hypothesis, as already mentioned, having a hypothesis is not essential. However, a hypothesis is important in terms of bringing clarity to the research problem. Specifically, it serves the following functions. Hunch of assumption, phase 1. Phase 2, investigate or study. Phase 3, conclude true or false. The formulation of hypothesis provides a study with focus. It tells you what specific aspects of a research problem to investigate. A hypothesis tells you what data to collect and what not to collect, thereby providing focus to the study. As it provides a focus, the construction of hypothesis enhances objectivity in a study. A hypothesis may enable you to add to the formulation of theory and help you to bridge the gaps in the body of knowledge. According to Kerlinger, hypotheses are a particularly potent means of objectively bridging the gap between one's beliefs and empirical reality. Types of hypothesis. There are two categories of hypothesis: research hypothesis, second one alternate hypothesis. A research hypothesis, one form is directional hypothesis. The investigator makes a prediction about the expected outcome, basing this prediction on prior literature and studies on the topic that suggest a potential outcome. For example, the researcher may predict that score will be higher for group A than for group B on the dependent variable, or that group A will change more than group B on the outcome. These examples illustrate a directional hypothesis because an expected prediction is made. Another form is non-directional hypothesis. A prediction is made but the exact form of differences is not specified because the researcher does not know what can be predicted from past literature. There is a significant difference in the perception in different groups of respondents and the effectiveness of the program in visuals. There is a difference between two groups. It is written as HR. Alternate hypothesis. It makes a prediction that in the general population no relationship or no significant difference exists between groups on a variable. There is no significant difference between the groups. There is no significant difference in the perception of different groups of respondents and the effectiveness of the program in visuals. Example, it is written as H0. Research hypothesis. Application of biofertilizer increase the plant growth. Alternative hypothesis. Application of biofertilizer do not increase plant growth. Criteria for a good hypothesis. The hypothesis should state an expected relationship between two or more variables in correlational studies, that is, those in which data on two or more variables are collected on the same individuals and correlations are computed. A direct relationship is usually stated in the hypothesis. For example, a directional hypothesis for a correlational study might state there is a significant positive relationship between mental health and job satisfaction of teachers. In experimental studies, where an experimental treatment such as a new teaching method is administered to one group of subjects but not to another group, differences between the treatments are usually hypothesized. The researcher should have definite reasons based on either theory or evidence for considering the hypothesis worthy of testing. After completing the review of literature, the research worker will have detailed knowledge of previous work relating to his research. A hypothesis should be testable. A hypothesis are generally stated so as to indicate an expected difference or an expected relationship between the measures used in the research. The relationships or differences that are stated into the hypothesis should be such that measurement of the variables involved can be made and necessary statistical comparisons carried out in order to determine whether the hypothesis as stated or is not supported by the research. The hypothesis should be as brief as possible, consistent with clarity. In stating hypothesis, the simplest and most concise statement of the relationship expected is generally the best. Brief, clear hypotheses are easier for the reader to understand and also easier for the research worker to test. Testing of a hypothesis. To test a hypothesis, you need to go through a process that comprises three phases: constructing a hypothesis, gathering appropriate evidence, analyzing evidence to draw conclusions as to its validity. Phase 1, formulate your hunch or assumption. Phase 2, collect the required data. Phase 3, to analyze the data. to draw conclusions about that and true or false. Errors in testing a hypothesis. A hypothesis is an assumption that may prove to be either correct or incorrect. It is possible to arrive at an incorrect conclusion about a hypothesis for a variety of reasons. Incorrect conclusions about the validity of a hypothesis may be drawn if the study design selected is faulty, the sampling procedure adopted is faulty, the method of data collection is inaccurate, the analysis is wrong, the statistical procedures applied are inappropriate, or the conclusions drawn are incorrect. Type 1 and Type 2 errors in testing a hypothesis. Null hypothesis, true or false. Null hypothesis accepted, correct decision. Type 1 error, reject. Type 2 error, correct decision. Some or all of these aspects of the research process could be responsible for the inadvertent introduction of error in your study, making conclusions misleading. Hence, in the testing of hypothesis, there is always the possibility of errors attributable to the reasons identified above. Hence, in drawing conclusions about a hypothesis, two types of error can occur. Rejection of a null hypothesis when it is true. This is known as a type 1 error. Acceptance of a null hypothesis when it is false. This is known as type 2 error. Dear learners, try to attend this assessment. Hypothesis arises from a word. A hypothesis is a conjectural statement of the relationship between two or more. There is no significant difference between the groups is an example of dash hypothesis. If the null hypothesis is also called as dash, there is a significant positive relationship between mental health and job satisfaction on teachers. Type 1 error is occurred when null hypothesis is. Type 2 error is occurred when null hypothesis is. Null hypothesis is denoted by girls' ability of learning moral sciences better than boys is an example of. Girls' ability of learning moral sciences differ than boys is an example of.